Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Thanks to one of our previous guests, Kayla Fratt from Canine Conservationists. We have our next guest here, and she's also coming to us from Corvallis, Oregon, but she has been working, she's a PhD fellow with the National Scientific Institute. Did I get that right, Ellen?
A National Science Foundation is who pays me.
National Science Foundation, thank you. And so we already have Ellen's voice on there, but she is Ellen Dymit, and we're going to talk a little bit more about sea wolves and her research and the things that she's doing on the Katmai Coast and other stuff. So how are you doing today, Ellen?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we generally, well, I can't speak for Stephen, but I generally get very excited with anything to do with sea wolves. And ever since we interviewed Tom McPherson with Seaforth Expeditions and then Island of Sea Wolves, it's just, I know they're in the same group, but I don't know what it is about them, but just being on the beach and being from the East Coast, I just love those guys and gals, and they just are so fascinating. So for everybody out there who doesn't know you personally, how did this all begin for you? Where did you grow up? What was your passion like? Were nature, wolves, things like that always in the foreground, or did this something that sort of came along afterwards?
Yeah, well, like a lot of wolf biologists, I grew up in the Midwest. I don't know why, but it seems like there's a bit of a pipeline there from upper Midwest to wolf biology. I grew up specifically in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and did a lot of camping as a kid up in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And a part of that was frequently visiting the International Wolf Center in Ely and seeing the captive wolves they had there. And then eventually hearing wild wolves howling while I was camping up there. So the fascination with wolves specifically definitely started early. But my kind of path through wildlife that brought me here was a little bit more winding. When I was an undergrad, my first work with animals was in a lab to study pollination ecology. So I was actually working with bumblebees and flowers. And then I ended up doing an independent project with salamanders after that. And then started working with the Atlanta Urban Coyote Project. So that was kind of my first canine work. And then after finishing undergrad, which was at Emory University in Atlanta, I did a Fulbright in Norway for 1 year where I studied Arctic foxes. And then while I was living in Norway working with the Fox Project, I applied to graduate school and ended up getting this NSF fellowship, and then decided to take that to Oregon State University because there was an opportunity to work here on a project with wolves up in Alaska. And it had always kind of been a goal of mine, not only to work with wolves, but also to do some field work in Alaska. So I couldn't really say no to that opportunity.
I don't think many of us could. Was there ever a moment in time back in Minnesota where you had any sort of, I wouldn't say interaction, but was there a sense when you were camping that you felt like this was your career trajectory when you're sitting there in Minneapolis and obviously visiting the Wolf Center, that this is the track I want to go on?
Yeah, totally. I mean, not so much so during my time in the city, but being in, really remote wilderness areas and just the kind of connection that you can have with animals in that setting. And, hearing wolves at night, hearing loons out on the lake, feeling kind of like we were the only people out there, and that all of that experience, wasn't for us, but that we were a part of something very special and very primitive. That feeling is when I found out that is something I could have as a career. It definitely was always the aspiration.
And you feel like you heard wolves up there often, or just a handful of times, or?
Handful of times camping, with friends and family. But then there was one summer during my undergrad, actually my summer after my freshman year of college, I wanted to go back to the Boundary Waters, so worked as a trail crew member with the Forest Service there, and we did some trail clearing work in really remote parts of the Boundary Waters where there were a lot less of a human footprint, and heard wolves a lot more often there and would see their tracks on the beach. I never actually saw any wolves in person until I went up to Alaska, though.
Wow.
Man, why do you think there's a pipeline from the Midwest or the upper Midwest to all of these remote places, or at least to the western part of the United States, to, it seems, to mostly study large carnivores and large ungulates? What do you think the reason is for that? Or, if you can tap into any of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Minnesota and a lot of places in the northern and western United States, we have a lot more wilderness protected, and access to that wilderness is not only easier for a lot of people, but also kind of, I'd say, more of a part of the culture. Like Minnesotans, a lot of them that I know identify really strongly with camping and canoeing and kind of all the North Woodsy activities. So I think that there is just an appreciation for wild places that comes with growing up in those areas and draws people into, careers in wildlife.
When you go west, and what was the draw for Alaska specifically? I think for many of us, I can speak for myself, that when you look at Alaska, it seems like it's really an entire other world as opposed to being part of the United States. I think specifically, you think of the contiguous United States, but Alaska's there, and it's this place that you feel doesn't really exist. What was that draw for you?
Well, I mean, Alaska is bigger and more expansive and more wild and more wildlife dense than anything we have in the lower 48. And, knowing that, it was immediately an objective for me. But also just, it's a lot easier to find yourself in a really remote place in Alaska, versus, even in Minnesota. That's something you have to pretty deliberately seek out. It means driving and canoeing across several lakes to get to a spot where you're not going to see any people. But up in Alaska, I mean, it's so big and so rugged that it's a lot easier to access or to find places where you can truly feel alone with nature.
And what were some of your favorite locations in Alaska?
Oh man, I've been in so many just undescribably beautiful places. My favorite field site is a spot on the Katmai Coast. It's called Cape Douglas. It's outside of the areas that people typically go for bear viewing. So we're the only people on the ground there when we were there. And the reason it's so special is that a lot of the coastline is these massive cliffs that you can actually find like plant fossils inside because they're these like shale formations. So that's really unique. But also, the mountains are very close to the ocean there with kind of no foothills. So it's this super striking transition from sea to like snow-capped glaciated mountains. And camping like right at the foot of that is spectacular.
Man, that's wild. I mean, you described it there, but when you're doing research on the Katmai Coast, are you guys mostly towards, I would say, I guess the ocean front or the coastal part? Are you guys inland? Are you guys traversing all of that area, especially when you're doing this research? And you can dive into that now if you'd like, just so you can give people an idea of not only the landscape you're dealing with, but the type of research as you go up into this incredibly wild place.
Yeah, so to access the coast in Katmai to begin with, your options are, because the park is completely off of the road system, so your options are to take a bush plane from the nearest town, which is Kings Hammond, across the mountains, and to land that on the beach, or if you're in a float plane, you can land it on a lake or in the ocean if it's calm, or to take a boat across the Cook Inlet to get there from Homer. And we have done both, but we were primarily plane based. And so our kind of routine would be to weigh all of our gear because we're given a weight allowance for these small planes. And then kind of clown car style pack all of it in, with, I had just one other crew member that I had hired as my crewmate for our field work. And then also park biologists would come sometimes. So we'd usually be in a team of 2 or 4. And then we'd take the plane over these mountains, land it on the beach, unpack all of our gear, set up an electric fence because it's one of the most brown bear dense areas in the world, and pitch our camp there. And then we'd be there for 1 or 2 weeks at a time at each of our field sites to do our work. And we were camping basically on the beach or, just above kind of the beach at most of our field sites, uh, because one, the project was focusing on coastal wolves, and also because if you go even a mile inland from the coast, it becomes really difficult to walk across the terrain. Your options are like bear trails, which you have no idea where they go. They can be really wet sometimes and they're very overgrown. And a lot of plants in Alaska are not particularly hospitable. So yeah, and then on an average day, we would wake up and then spend the entire day, sometimes, more than 10 hours, just hiking, covering as much ground as we possibly can, and looking for wolf sign, wolf scats in particular. And yeah, the project objective was to collect wolf scat to study the diet of wolves living in these coastal areas. So backing up a little bit, the reason why we were deployed out on the Katmai Coast to study wolves is because the park started seeing wolves carrying sea otter carcasses in their mouths. And, it started as just a few scattered observations, and then park visitors started reporting it, and the rangers were seeing it in multiple areas. So that kind of prompted them to wonder whether this was a regular occurrence or whether it was, something wolves were doing, whenever they had the opportunity to, whether it was more of a strategy for them. So we were tasked with quantifying wolf diet with a process called fecal DNA metabarcoding, which we can talk more about, by analyzing as many of their scats as possible,
So
and to
when
find out how much sea otter they're eating.
Yeah. So describe that process of because we had Cecilia DiBernardi and she's doing a lot of those scat analyses over in Sweden as well. So is it the same process where you take it into a lab, you're dissecting it, and is it DNA you're looking for? Is it on a molecular level? What other kinds of things are you looking for inside of the scat, not just pertaining to diet?
Yeah. Quick sidebar. Cecilia and I worked on the Arctic Fox project together in Norway.
Oh,
So
nice. That's
a
awesome.
small world.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, all of our scat analysis is DNA based. So the process is taking the scats from the field back to the laboratory at Oregon State, and then we use a kit to extract the DNA from that poop. And the poops contain the DNA of the wolf, but also of every prey item that they've eaten. And then we use something called a primer, which is a specific strand that attaches to a region of the DNA that you would like to read with a sequencer. So in our case, we're interested in what vertebrate prey items the wolves are consuming. So we use a vertebrate specific primer that targets the 12S gene in the mitochondrial genome of the DNA, and then sequences that region, or we sequence that region rather with a sequencing machine. And then based on the unique genetic code of bases that we see in that sequence, we're able to identify what species of prey the DNA belongs to.
How long does that process take from start to finish, from getting the sample to reading the genome and the DNA and coming out with an actual conclusion?
Well, in a perfect world, barring, things like a big backlog of samples in the lab and like time constraints of lab technicians, and the fact that the sequencing capabilities of our university are under like a lot of demand from other labs, you could do it in less than a week. But basically the process is multi-step. It's extracting the DNA, and then it's cleaning the samples, and then it's pooling them together, and then, submitting them to be sequenced at the sequencing facility, and then sometimes waiting a couple of weeks depending on how busy they are.
Okay. Yeah, I mean it's constraints of everything for that. So when you're looking at these scats, or when you're looking at I would say I would imagine you guys have seen the behavior of the coastal wolves while you were there. What was the typical prey item for coastal wolves before, or what were they known to be hunting before everybody started to seeing them carrying these sea otter carcasses and going for those types of prey items?
Well, we have no we were the first project to formally look at wolf diet on the Katmai Coast, so we actually have no idea how long the sea otter eating has been happening or whether there even was a before. It's possible that, sea otters were extirpated from a lot of their northern range during the maritime fur trade, and then we reintroduced them by translocating otters from the Aleutian Islands to Southeast Alaska in the 60s. And then ever since that translocation, their population has been reoccupying its historic range. So moving across the Gulf of Alaska and up into places like the Cook Inlet. And they're, thought to have been at carrying capacity on the Katmai Coast for a while now. So it's quite possible that the wolves started eating them as soon as they arrived there. And also that this relationship between wolves and sea otters could have existed, historically before we extirpated sea otters from their range. So all we can really say for sure is that sea otters are now the most common item that we're detecting in wolf diet and
Oh, wow.
Katmai. Yeah,
Jeez.
it's
Wow.
pretty astounding. They're also eating a lot of salmon, so that it would be like the other big category of prey for them is salmon and also oceanic fishes like crescent gunnels and starry flounder and things that they can catch in the sandy intertidal areas. And then beyond that, in terms of like typical prey, we see them eating things like beaver, which we also see with wolves in Minnesota and other places in the lower 48, and eating moose when they can get
Oh, okay.
it, but not nearly as commonly as we're seeing a lot of these marine subsidies show up in their diet.
Wow.
So they don't hunt ungulates regularly.
So they don't have the same access to ungulates that wolves in other places do. And Katmai in particular, there are no caribou herds on the coast. There's no deer either. So moose are like the ungulate option for them there. And we don't really have a good estimation of what moose densities are across
Wow.
the coast there. But it could be that, moose aren't super easy to come by, so wolves have adopted this otter focused strategy. Or it could just be that, they're eating moose when they can get them and they're eating otters when they can get them.
What does sort of access to smaller prey on a regular basis and not the larger prey that wolves usually are hunting? What does that sort of do to their pack dynamic? Anything that you've noticed? I mean, do they spend more time as individuals rather than in larger groups, or how does that manifest?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that kind of gets into the other side of this project, which is that in addition to studying wolf diets with the DNA metabarcoding, we're also identifying unique individual wolves, also using the DNA in their scats with a process called single nucleotide polymorphism based genotyping, which basically means that we look at the unique sequence of bases in the DNA of individual wolves and use their genetic variation to distinguish them. So it's like a genetic fingerprint that identifies individual wolves and also allows us to know their sex. So then we can look at, the GPS locations of the scats we've collected and then assign those dots on a map to individual wolves.
Mhm.
And then based on that, we can make assumptions about which wolves are in the same packs as one another because we don't have collars on them.
Yeah.
We're not doing any sort of, structured observation. So that's kind of our best guess at how they're structured socially. And what we've seen is that we have identified at least 50 unique individual wolves on the Katmai Coast. So that's a lot. It's
That's
a
great.
pretty big wolf population, especially given that we didn't even have time to sample the entire length of the coast. So there very well could be more individuals. And also, we see that their pack sizes range quite a bit. We have some packs where we were only able to identify 3 unique individual wolves. And then we have others where we have, more than 10 unique individual wolves that we identified in the same area. And sea otters aren't particularly small. They're a pretty large bodied prey item, but of
Yeah.
course, relative to a moose, they are smaller. So, the implication of that being that one, you need to kill more of them to be fed or scavenge. We think that there's a lot of scavenging happening too. Um, but also that you could feasibly, kill an otter by yourself, whereas killing an adult moose by yourself is a lot trickier, obviously. So that might, I can't say anything conclusive about how hunting behavior or pack structure would be shaped by reliance on sea otters, but we can assume that they are able to hunt alone or in small groups more often when they're targeting smaller bodied prey.
So is there a hard winter on the coast? I mean, does any of the coastline freeze at all? And if it does their diet change? I mean, being reliant on species that are reliant on water.
So, the coast is largely snow-free there,
Really?
and just because of, I guess, the ocean. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know how it works, but um, there are a couple things I want to say. So one is that otters do still hang out in shallow water and on that coastline in the wintertime,
Mm.
and they haul out of the water sometimes onto ice floes. Um, and if wolves are able to get onto the ice floes and hunt them, uh, that's still possible throughout the winter. And that's something that has been observed in other places in the Cook Inlet. Also, we don't know exactly what wolves are eating in the wintertime. I have a field trip planned for March of this year, or April, I believe, where we're going to try and find some scats to answer that question.
Mm.
But we did leave some cameras out, camera tripods out throughout the winter, and have video of wolves on the coast in December and January and February. So we know
Wow.
that at least some of these coastal wolves do stay out on the coast throughout the winter. So they
Mm.
must be eating something.
Wow.
And there's no evidence that these wolves on the coast ever move into the interior. It
Right.
would require crossing these huge glacier fields,
Yeah.
which if there's enough prey out on the coast, there's not really any incentive for them to do that.
Right.
Wow, that's hardcore.
That's crazy.
Mhm.
That is.
Mhm.
It's like you're really
Yeah.
doing it hard for yourself. Were you able to decipher it? Who was doing the majority? Like, was it fairly even in the hunting? I don't know if you found this out between males and females, or who was catching the prey, or where you were able to locate, the members of those small packs who was doing most of the hunting and killing, or was that not able to be figured out?
So we only had one actual observation of wolves killing an otter while we were there. We got really lucky we were out with our spotting scope and watched three wolves kind of work together to ambush and kill a sea otter that had hauled out on a rock at low tide. And in that instance, it was like one of them hid behind the rock. The other two kind of came around on either side and they ambushed it and dragged it up from the water and then pulled it apart. And that was the breeding male and breeding female of the pack, and then one of their male offspring from a previous year. We think, but beyond that, we don't really know kind of who's doing what parts of the hunting for the pack. We can look at kind of diet composition for males versus females across the entire park. And we don't see super obvious like sex differences in their diet.
When you're looking at the diet composition as compared to wolves in the interior, where they're hunting mostly ungulates, larger meat, larger organs, a little bit more nutritional value, are you noticing multiple different types, like you were saying, fish, sea otter, whatever else they may be scavenging on? Is it a multi-faceted scat, I guess, in terms of prey items that you're finding to complete the diet and nutrition that they all need?
I think that we calculated like the average number of prey items per scat. So how many different things are they having in each like meal on average? And that was around 1.5. So between 1 and 2 different prey items per scat on average. And there is a lot of variety in their diet. So I think we identified more than 50 unique individual prey items within wolf diet across the whole park, ranging from, birds and ducks and even like bald eagle,
Oh,
which
wow.
they're probably scavenging, who knows, to, really small fish like three-spined sticklebacks and sculpin from like tide pools, um, all the way to, bigger things like porcupines and river otter and things like that. So they definitely get a very a very wide variety of different prey items and nutrients in their diet. And I will say that, sea otters and especially salmon are probably pretty fat dense. So that is a good, source of nutrition for them as well, especially the salmon. Uh, Individual wolves, when we look at the diets of individual wolves, we do see some evidence of specialization, like certain wolves hunt fish most often, or certain wolves are hunting a lot of sea otter, whereas other members of their pack are eating a lot more small rodents. And it's hard to say based on our pretty limited sample size. Sometimes we only have 5 or 10 scats identified for each wolf. So it's a very small snapshot of their diet, but that sort of thing could be evidence of a little bit of partitioning within a social group of who does kind of what type of hunting and also who gets access to what quality of food. Like you would expect in a lot of kind of stereotypical wolf social hierarchy situations, the breeding couple of the pack to have kind of first pick of what they eat.
So when you're making your assumptions and your hypotheses about sort of their hunting strategies, if you were to look at and guess, what would be some of the techniques I guess they would use? You kind of gave us an instance of when you guys saw them get a sea otter, but when we're talking about salmon and other, I mean, these are fish in the ocean that I don't assume they would come close to shore, but what would you guess would be the ways that they would do that to get any type of fish? Because it's not like we can corral a moose and it's like we're on flat ground. Now we're talking about going into the ocean, which is a whole different ballgame.
Totally. So, wolf observations of wolves fishing are actually pretty common in Katmai, not only for the biologists, but also for visitors of the park. And so we know that their strategy is what we'd call the dash and grab, which is the same thing that bears will do when they're hunting salmon on a salmon run, where they kind of wait by the water or even standing in the water and see a fish come nearby, and then they run at it and grab it with their mouth. And they're pretty successful at this. There was somebody out there the same summer as me who was watching a wolf fishing at one of our field sites and saw it catch 10 salmon out of 10 attempts.
Whoa.
So they're definitely good at fishing. At least some of them, some of the individuals we've seen are. And we think that when it comes to things like the marine mammals, like not just sea otters, but also harbor seals, they are often, when hunting them, adopting a sort of ambush strategy, which is similar to how we now know wolves hunt beavers, where they are waiting for the moment when, these animals that are not necessarily the best movers on land to get a little too far away from the water. And then the wolf will cut off their route of escape and kind of sometimes drag them further away from the water to kill them. And the park biologist at the time of this field work we did, Kelsey Griffin, she actually saw a single wolf battle with and kill a adult harbor seal by itself.
Wow.
That
Damn.
had, exactly under these circumstances gotten too far away from the water such that the wolf was able to grab its tail and pull it up the beach a bit and then kill it.
Man, because harbor seals are not small creatures. So that
No,
is
yeah.
a massive feat to do that.
Totally. And the harbor seal was fighting back the whole time. There's we put out a paper about this observation, and there's some still photos in the paper. You can see where the seal is kind of cranking its neck back to try and bite the wolf while the wolf is dragging it by its tail.
Man, I mean, that's just, yeah, that's crazy. Are you guys seeing, I don't know if you have, and I know this research expanded to Lake Clark and Glacier Bay and all this. Are you guys noticing, if you can tell from the DNA and the scat that you guys are collecting, if the coastal wolves, I wouldn't say are having an easier time or a longer lifespan than sort of the wolves in the interior? Because it seems as though there are less physical obstacles that would, meaning not getting kicked in the face by hooves and speared by antlers and so on and so forth. Are you noticing a longer lifespan for coastal wolves just in general, or is that not, there's not enough research for that yet?
We haven't been following the same wolves for long enough to say anything about that. But one of my colleagues, who's a postdoctoral researcher in our lab, Charlotte Erickson, has done a lot of coastal wolf work in Southeast Alaska, kind of in a lot of the same region that Kayla's working now. And there she has been collecting data with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game on the same individual wolves over multiple years. So hopefully, that forthcoming research will be able to say something more about, how wolves do under a heavily marine diet compared to a more traditional diet. One thing that we have kind of started thinking about and are interested in pursuing in future, research is whether eating all of this marine prey is exposing wolves to risks that they wouldn't get from a terrestrial diet, whether that be something like paralytic shellfish toxins, which are in a lot of the clams and mussels that we know wolves are eating in these areas, or something like bioaccumulation of mercury, leading to mercury poisoning or other heavy metals that could be, have some sort of health impact for wolves with a heavily marine diet.
Wow.
When
That is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think about that actually. When you look at them too, are they're of smaller build, I would imagine, right? Because all the pictures I see, they look a little bit more slender, and their coats are obviously different color. Is that, I'm sure that's just environmental. I mean, if you look at Mexican grays to timbers to wolves in Yellowstone to coastal sea wolves, like everything is, they all adapt to their spot where they live. So that's just an adaptation for them to be a little bit more of like that orangey red color. And it looks like they have green eyes, but I don't know if that's a possibility or not. Like, are those just adaptations that you guys have seen?
It's hard to say whether the physical qualities in terms of their coat color are things that actually resulted from some type of natural selection process. But it is definitely interesting that all of the wolves we saw on the Katmai Coast were really light colored in their coat, like almost sandy colored. That is, something that we kind of hemmed and hawed about a bit. Uh, and yeah, they definitely are smaller seeming in their build compared to like Yellowstone wolves, for example.
And when you guys are there doing for a couple weeks at a time, what is your, I know Kayla said this a lot with their work with canine conservationists, is it's very non-invasive. I assume that's what you guys do. It's very non-invasive. You don't get too close. Have there been any points where you guys have had closer interactions or closer hearing, hearing them howl close to you guys? Is that any of those things come up while you're out there?
Yeah, well, yeah, our work is all non-invasive. We never pursue or capture wolves. We never go on to the den sites while the wolves are there. And, all of our kind of observation work is either, with automatic camera traps or from a distance with a spotting scope. That being said, because we're working in areas where these wolves have never been persecuted, they're national parks, so they're protected. The wolves are not super afraid of people, and there were, several instances where we were observing wolves that kind of came past us on the beach with kind of a curiosity about them rather than fear. Uh, there were a couple instances where we got close to wolves that were resting, and in one case we got to see a wolf bear interaction happen
Wow.
where these two wolves were kind of taking a nap on a sandbar in a river, and a bear came by and decided to harass them. It was a subadult male bear, so it's pretty typical for them to be troublemakers, and it just kind of went over to these senior looking wolves and stirred them up and chased them around a bit before walking on. And there were also instances where we were camping at an area where wolves had pretty young pups on a rendezvous site, and we got to hear the puppies practice howling, which they're not very good at, but you have to learn how to become a wolf
Yeah.
somehow. So getting to hear them howl a couple times, and we would also do howling surveys to try and triangulate the den sites. So we would kind of have one person in one area and then another person walk a couple hundred meters away, and then we would howl back and forth at each other and try and see if we could get the wolves to join in with the howling, but we didn't really have any success with that.
Wow.
And bears stay there throughout the winter as well.
The bears, a lot of them will go into a den over the winter time, but not always. And it's not super well studied in all parts of the coast there, but there, are some people who think that there are bears that never need to go into any sort of like torpor or anything over the winter time because they're able to continually access food, especially in these coastal areas. Uh, we did have a lot more close interactions with bears than with wolves during our field work. There's just so many of them.
Wow.
Like hardly a day would go by where we didn't see at least one big brown bear. And they are also very curious and would come up to our camping sites and be curious about our gear. We had one try to pop our pack raft at a certain point. We had to light a flare one time to kind of deter a subadult bear that was circling us on the beach. So the bear interactions were definitely a lot more frequent out there.
Wow. And then what's the dynamic? I mean, you had that one story with the subadult messing with the senior wolves. Is that a normal occurrence? They must interact all the time, obviously. If this is, I mean, they're eating common prey sources, so I'd imagine they're getting sea otters and salmon and all that stuff too.
Yeah, totally. The bears are definitely also scavenging and hunting otters, and of course, the salmon is very important for them. We captured a really interesting wolf bear interaction on one of our camera traps as a video where we had put this camera up on a rendezvous site, which is where the wolves will move with their pups when the pups get a little bit bigger and they're able to kind of leave the den site. In this case, it was a big kind of sandbar from an old bend of the river. And it was a wolf and a bear that did this almost like game of chicken where they charged back and forth at each other. But the charging was half-hearted in a way that made it seem like they were familiar with each other. And it was almost playful. It wasn't super aggressive or anything like that based on their body language. So that was really interesting. It makes you wonder, they're sharing space and resources, like you said. So it's like, they're not necessarily hostile towards each other all the time. Especially when there's enough food to go around for everybody. Like during the salmon run, the whole landscape is littered with carcasses of salmon that, whoever caught it couldn't finish. So there's not any incentive to be hostile towards one another.
Yeah.
Man, we're gonna have to get up there.
That's fascinating.
Just talk about this. There's so many fascinating things. Talk about the expansion from Katmai to Lake Clark to Glacier Bay. What it must have been an overwhelming success, or there was just so much more information that needed to be gathered, or wanted to be gathered, obviously, from the initial stuff that you guys did at Katmai. So what does that tell you that they wanted to, or there was a need to expand this research, maybe from yourself or from other colleagues or folks that took it over?
Well, we were originally planning on doing multiple field seasons in Katmai, but in just this one summer of 2021, we found like around 1,000 scat samples, which was way more than we were expecting to find. So we were then thinking we don't really need another field season here. It would be cooler to expand to other areas with coastal wolves. And Lake Clark, the park was interested in having work done there. And it provided a really interesting point of comparison to Katmai because Lake Clark represents a region of the Cook Inlet in Alaska where sea otter reoccupation is only just starting. So Lake Clark is further north than Katmai, and sea otters are kind of just starting to be seen frequently off of the coast there versus being well established on the Katmai coast. Looking at wolf diet in Katmai versus Lake Clark allowed us this sort of natural experiment of how wolf diet looks kind of pre and post sea otter recolonization. And then adding Glacier Bay into the mix was, about not just expanding the project to include more similar but still different sites, but also Glacier Bay represents kind of a place that's very close to the origin of that sea otter reintroduction effort in the 60s, where, otter reoccupation has been progressing for much longer. And also it represents a place where wolves not only have access to the otters, but also have access to a wider variety of ungulate prey. So both Lake Clark and Katmai, they only have moose on the coast. But when you go to Glacier Bay over on the other side of the Gulf of Alaska, suddenly you have black-tailed deer that they can eat, and you have mountain goats that they can eat in some places. So it provided, just a way for us to compare wolf diet under different circumstances of large prey availability across, relatively environmentally similar systems.
Were you seeing, or are you able to tell us any differences in the scats that were collected, or is that still going on in terms of you were able to, obviously we're looking at Katmai, so there's more sea otter there. Did it decrease as you went up to Lake Clark and Glacier Bay, and was it more ungulate based, or was it sort of similar?
Yeah, so in Lake Clark, moose are the most common thing that wolves are eating. So that's kind of what you would expect for like a stereotypical wolf population. Like, oh, they're targeting the large ungulate prey item. We did still see some marine prey items turning up in their diet, so fish, and I think there was one instance of sea otter, or there were, several scats that had sea otter in them from one area. So we think, they might have scavenged an otter that had washed up there or maybe even killed it. But the diet of the wolves in Lake Clark relative to Katmai was definitely more terrestrially focused. And then over in Glacier Bay, you get this, demonstration of how this marine focused and terrestrial focused foraging strategy is not a mutually exclusive situation, because we see sea otters really commonly in scats in Glacier Bay, but we also see ungulate prey really commonly. So it's not like, the wolves there have picked one strategy or the other. It's that they're eating whatever is available to them there. So, and that, of course, depends on the pack. There are certain areas of the coast where it's easier to access sea otters either by hunting or by scavenging compared to other areas. And same goes for the ungulate prey. Like mountain goats are not, available across the entire park. It's only certain spots where the wolves can access them. But writ large, we see kind of both marine and terrestrial foraging strategies happening in Glacier Bay.
When you talk about this sea otter reintroduction that you've mentioned a couple of times here, what's the reproductive rate, if you know it, for sea otter? Because it seems we're talking roughly, we'll just use 1960 as a point of reference, I guess, but we're talking 60 years to take, I guess, that amount of time for the population to be healthy enough in Katmai, right? Is it taking longer in these places just because sea otters breed slow, or there's not as many pups? I don't know what the reproductive rate, I don't know if you know either, but that's an interesting thing I didn't know about, is the extirpation of sea otter because of the fur trade, and then also them having to be reintroduced and all these other things.
Mm-hmm. You will probably want to fact check this. I'm not an otter biologist,
Okay.
but I do know that they can breed year round, so they don't have a discrete breeding season, and that females typically have one pup at a time. But I think that as if that pup dies for some reason, they're able to become pregnant again fairly quickly. So I think that because of that, they are able to reoccupy and progress, across the range again pretty quickly. It's not like, something with a discrete breeding season that might be more limited in their ability to reoccupy. And they can exist in extremely high densities, especially in some places in Glacier Bay. You'll see these rafts of like hundreds of sea otters hanging out together. So it's actually their reintroduction is quite controversial, because there are people who believe that they are negatively impacting some of the fisheries in the area by eating so much, and that, vessel strikes is a concern with otters. And
Wow.
so, yeah, it's definitely a very hot button issue up in Alaska.
Hmm.
We
Interesting.
joke that the only thing Alaskans hate more than wolves is sea otters, so it's a good thing that the wolves are eating them.
There's a
Yeah.
relationship there. Look at that.
Yeah.
I want to ask you this from a personal perspective, because you're in biology, but you also have this molecular science aspect of your career. What sort of, I don't want to say gives you more joy, but like, what are there pieces of each that you were like, I can't wait to do this on the molecular science side, and then obviously in the field when you're doing biology and collecting scat? Or are you able to switch your brain sort of from one place to the other, or is it kind of simultaneous for you?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed having a lot of super different aspects to the workflow for my project. Obviously, my favorite is the field work because, being in Alaska or, the other places I work, and camping and, getting to be out there and feel like I'm still working is pretty amazing. But learning all of the wet lab stuff and, putting on a podcast and doing my 5 hours of pipetting in the lab, that can also be really nice too. And I think that I haven't had to do too much of anything. Like it's felt very balanced and satisfying in that way. Um, I will say I was really intimidated by the molecular aspects of this project at first because I had no genetics background coming into graduate school. I didn't even take a genetics course during college. Um, but I had a lot of really wonderful mentors in the lab to help me get up to speed on all of the modern techniques. And I'm still learning things all the time. And it did not end up being nearly as difficult or intimidating to learn as I had anticipated.
That's good. What are some things that you're looking forward to in this project in particular? Obviously, the expansion's great. Is there something that you are personally doing, heading up that people would be interested in knowing what's coming for the future of this? Because already the work that you did almost 4 years ago has catapulted and expanded probably beyond what you thought it was going to be.
Totally. Yeah. I am looking forward to getting all of this diet data that we have from the 3 parks published and out into the world for others to read soon, hopefully. I'm currently working on writing up some work from one of my other projects, but after that, this is next on the docket. So that's kind of my immediate goal. But then, of course, there are also all of these lines of follow-up questioning that we have after finishing, our initial field seasons at all of these places. The first is, like I already mentioned, these questions about exposure to paralytic shellfish toxins. And just as kind of like a teaser for that, we did have kind of a pilot batch of samples tested from Katmai coastal wolves for levels of paralytic shellfish toxin, and some of those scats came back with extremely elevated levels of shellfish toxin, which to us, was kind of the green light for us to go ahead with testing a wider batch or a larger batch of samples for that. So that is kind of a aspect of the project that is forthcoming and in the works right now. The other thing that I already mentioned is, the winter wolf diet. So hopefully everything will work out for us to get out to Katmai this spring and do some scat collection. Hopefully we'll find the wolves and be able to get a good sample size to understand kind of what they're eating in the winter time and whether that is a different strategy than what we see for their summer diet. And then also just continuing to expand this project across subsequent years. So encouraging the biologists that are working in each of these parks to continue collecting samples so that we can analyze them and get a longer time series of wolf diets in these places, particularly in Lake Clark as otters, expand on the coastline there. I think it would be really cool for us to have this sort of year by year documentation of wolf diet as it shifts potentially to a more otter focused strategy like what we see in Katmai.
I'm always curious about this kind of really interesting and nuanced research and how you or researchers themselves think about it, because it's obviously 100% fascinating. But this is a good example. Just trying to determine mercury levels in wolves. I wonder whether you saw it or see it as simply exploration and discovery, or if you can see ahead of time how it might be implemented in policy or conversation, and if that even really matters at the time. So I'm just curious how you feel about it usually.
Well, I think that everybody hopes, especially in wildlife, everybody hopes that their research will be translated somehow into actionable policy change or management strategy
Right.
implementation
Yeah.
for whatever animals they're working on. I know already our work in Katmai helped inform their kind of writing of a new wilderness management plan for the
Oh,
park,
wow.
and them understanding, where the wolf den sites were, which we found several that, were not previously known, and kind of what resources in terms of food and habitat are most important for these wolves.
Exactly. Yeah.
That helped them decide which areas should be protected.
Wow.
But with the mercury and stuff, it's a really interesting it's an interesting world. The level of uh paralytic shellfish toxin that we have deemed inedible for humans. So like there's a cutoff of concentration of paralytic shellfish toxin in mussels over which you're not supposed to eat them. That threshold was determined based on a single instance of somebody getting sick from shellfish toxin.
Right.
So we don't actually have a really good grasp of, even for people, what the implications of exposure to these toxins is.
Right.
So I think that there's a lot of difficulty in translating any sort of paralytic shellfish toxin findings into, anything actionable for wolves. Yeah. I think it would be tricky, but establishing whether this is of concern for coastal wolf populations at all is, a necessary starting point for all of that.
This brings me back to when we spoke to Kara Love about the wolves in Chernobyl. Same thing is like these wolves are surviving in a place where the radiation levels are, still. I mean, I don't think humans could live there, but yet these wolves and these like all these species are just sort of making their way there. So I wonder if there's going to be somewhat of a correlation of like, for some reason, wolves can live with these types of toxins or this level of mercury in their bodies more so than humans because they can process it. I don't know. I'm sure that's something you guys are looking into because that would be an interesting parallel for them to see from coast to, radiation sites or something like that. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, well, animals like otters that eat toxic clams or have the risk of eating toxic clams have adapted to avoiding toxicity exposure. For example, if they are forced to forage on clams with really high toxin levels, they'll actually discard the siphon of the clam, which is the part of the clam that has the highest concentration of those toxins. So animals are much smarter than we give them credit for, and much more adaptable. And I think a common thread through modern wolf research has been that a lot of our assumptions about, what wolves need to survive, have been kind of disproven. Like they clearly don't need ungulate populations to survive in all instances. Like the Katmai wolves themselves kind of disprove that. Um, and they can find food in a lot of environments where their kind of typical prey options aren't available. So,
I mean, yeah, I guess other than what you told us, what's next for you? Are you looking for more internet? Are you locked in? Not locked in a bad way, but you're locked in for coastal sea wolf research? Are you going back to any of the places that you mentioned earlier on? Like I know you were in Norway, you've done some stuff in Guatemala and all that stuff. Are you locked in with coastal wolves for now, or are you trying to do other side projects as well?
I really love both the coastal wolf work and the stuff I'm doing in Central America, with primarily with large cats. And I want to continue like expanding and deepening my lines of research questioning in both of those areas. So I see the best kind of route forward where I can continue doing work in these super different systems, being to stay in academia and become a professor and lead a research program and have graduate students that I can that I can work with, towards deepening these existing research projects rather than jumping onto something new, because I'm definitely not bored of any of it yet. And I think that there's so much, we're always left with more questions than answers at the end of, a bout of analysis. So I want to keep going with what I already have going here.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah. We just got to get you a Dymit lab. We'll just do that.
Oh man, that is the dream.
That is the dream. It can
Yeah.
happen. Things can happen. Anybody who's looking for what's available currently, what's the best resource for them to find out any of the information or expand the information that we talked about today?
Yeah, well, we have a paper out in Ecology. It is in the ecology journal, The Scientific Naturalist, which is great because it's a journal focused on natural history observations. So it's very accessible reading for people who don't necessarily have a science background. And the paper, I believe, is called Wolves on the Katmai Coast Hunt Seals and Sea Otters. And it's a detailed description of our observations of wolves hunting marine mammals out there with a lot of good photos. So check that out for sure. And then I am on Twitter, but I mostly post trail camera videos from Alaska and Guatemala. So if you want to see animals, jaguars and birds and all sorts of things like that, give me a follow. It's just at Ellen Dymit. And yeah, stay tuned for more papers coming soon. I'm working on something from my Guatemala project right now, which will hopefully be out in the world soon. And then we're hoping to get this Alaska work published within the next year or so as well.
Oh, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. Anybody who's listening will have that paper. I was reading that paper before we had you on. So we'll have that in the link to the description. And I saw there was a photo there with, I think it was 4 wolves. Like you had one of the tripod cameras and they were all like looking at this tripod camera. It was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
So really interesting stuff and just awesome work. Last question for you, Ellen, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Oh man. I'd say like wilderness. They're such a embodiment of, you know, what is out there in the world and what has always been out there in the world before people and all of that. So
Cool. That's awesome. Alan Dymit, thank you so much
Yeah.
for more coastal wolf stuff. I can't get enough of this, so you've put more of a fire in my belly to get up there and just go to these national parks and see these wolves. So thank you for the information and all the research you're doing. Really appreciate it.
thank you. Thanks for this opportunity.
Of course. Hang tight while we sign off. How's to y'all out there? We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.